There's a film sitting in cinema history that most people think they understand, and almost all of them are wrong. MASH, released in 1970, looks like a movie barely keeping itself together. The dialogue trips over itself, the editing lurches from scene to scene, the humor collides violently with horror, and the whole production carries the uneasy feeling of something spinning just slightly out of control. First-time viewers often walk away unsure whether what they witnessed was brilliance or a happy accident. That uncertainty is precisely the point. Every single element that feels unstable, unpolished, or accidental was constructed with complete deliberate intention by a director who understood exactly what he was doing at every moment. Robert Altman did not stumble into this style. He engineered it from the ground up, dismantling decades of Hollywood convention and replacing those conventions with something raw, stranger, and far more honest. What makes the story behind this film so remarkable is not just what ended up on screen, but everything that almost prevented it from existing at all, and the extraordinary secrets hiding inside every frame. Before a single camera rolled, the project was already being written off. Studio executives read the script and saw trouble immediately. The tone refused to cooperate with any recognizable formula. Dark comedy and wartime trauma have been kept carefully separate in Hollywood for good reason, because nobody could predict how audiences would react when those elements were forced to share the same space. Confidence in the film's commercial appeal hovered somewhere close to zero, and the general consensus inside the studio was that this project had minor, forgettable release written all over it. What saved it from outright cancellation was something almost embarrassingly simple. The budget was low enough that the financial risk felt manageable. Studio executives calculated they could afford to lose the money without serious damage, and that calculation led them to a decision that would accidentally reshape cinema. They let the production move forward without meaningful interference, not because they believed in it, but because they didn't care enough to fight over it. That indifference handed Robert Altman something more valuable than enthusiasm or support. It handed him freedom, and he used every inch of it. Once cameras were rolling, the script transformed into something almost unrecognizable from a traditional Hollywood production document. Most filmmakers treat the screenplay as sacred architecture, a blueprint that actors follow precisely and directors protect carefully. Altman treated his script more like a rough suggestion that the cast was actively encouraged to abandon, whenever instinct pointed somewhere more interesting. Dialogue shifted constantly mid-take. Actors changed lines, invented exchanges, and redirected scenes while cameras kept rolling and Altman kept watching without calling cut. Scene order bent to accommodate what felt right in the moment rather than what the page originally demanded. The result was a production that evolved organically, shaped more by collective instinct than by any pre-planned precision. Moments that feel effortlessly natural in the finished film were discovered on set rather than crafted in a writer's room, emerging from creative chaos that Altman had deliberately created and carefully maintained. He believed that spontaneity could capture something no structured script ever could, and he was willing to let the entire production find its own rhythm, even when that meant abandoning the blueprint almost entirely. When early cuts of the film reached studio executives, many assumed something had gone catastrophically wrong in post-production. Characters constantly talked over each other. Clean, followable dialogue seemed nearly impossible to isolate. To ears trained on decades of studio filmmaking, where every important word lands clearly and audiences are guided precisely where to focus their attention, this sounded like a technical disaster requiring immediate correction before the film could be released to the public. The truth was that the overlapping voices were completely intentional, one of the most carefully constructed elements in the entire production. Altman wanted conversations to feel genuinely chaotic, the way real people actually speak when crowded into a room together where nobody waits politely for their turn and multiple conversations compete simultaneously for space. He rejected outright the long-standing convention that audiences needed to hear every word clearly. Confusion became a stylistic choice rather than a flaw to fix, and that choice made scenes feel inhabited rather than performed. Viewers were not meant to catch every line. They were meant to feel immersed in the noise, participating in the disorder rather than observing it safely from a distance. The comedy throughout the film operates in a way that deliberately refuses to provide comfort, which separates it sharply from how humor typically functions in war films. In most productions dealing with conflict, jokes exist to release tension. A laugh lands, the audience exhales, and everyone gets a brief emotional reprieve before the next difficult sequence arrives. MASH refuses that bargain completely. Humor arrives during surgery, alongside exhaustion, in the middle of emotional collapse, in precisely the moments where laughter feels most wrong. Characters crack jokes not because situations are light, but because comedy is the only coping mechanism available against horror that never stops arriving. The audience laughs and then sits with the discomfort of having laughed, never settling into one clean emotion for long. Altman designed this tonal friction intentionally, forcing viewers to experience amusement layered directly over stress and quiet desperation that never fully resolves. Comedy becomes something closer to a survival strategy than entertainment. And that distinction gives every joke in the film an unexpected weight that lingers long after the scene ends. Hidden inside what appears to be the film's most purely entertaining sequence is one of its sharpest pieces of social commentary, wrapped so skillfully in broad comedy that most viewers never notice the knife. The football game looks like slapstick relief, characters cheating shamelessly, chaos erupting across the field, the whole sequence playing as a goofy detour from the main narrative. It is one of the most purely fun moments in the film's entire runtime, and that enjoyment is precisely what makes it work so effectively as satire. Beneath the laughs, the game mirrors military and institutional behavior with surprising precision. The obsession with winning at any cost, the cheating elevated to strategy, the spectacle carefully maintained, while deeper dysfunction runs underneath. All of it reflects the absurdity of systems built around competition rather than purpose. Altman understood that audiences lower their defenses during comedy. By packaging sharp observations inside a chaotic football game, he smuggled genuine critique past viewers who might have resisted a more direct approach. The sequence works because it never announces its intentions. The laughs arrive first, and the meaning settles in quietly afterward, sometimes days later. The visual language of the film breaks just as deliberately from studio convention as everything else. Hollywood films of the era relied on steady cameras, careful framing, and compositions designed to look polished and intentional. Every shot communicated control. Altman threw that entire aesthetic out and borrowed, instead, from documentary filmmakers who have been covering actual military conflicts overseas with whatever equipment they could carry. Handheld cameras moved through scenes with an unstable energy that suggested reality rather than performance. Zoom lenses pushed in unexpectedly, mimicking the impulsive movement of news crews capturing events as they unfolded rather than staging them for maximum visual elegance. Framing often felt deliberately imperfect, with characters partially cut off or positioned awkwardly within the shot in ways that would have sent traditional cinematographers back for another take. None of this was carelessness. It was a carefully engineered rejection of Hollywood's polished visual vocabulary, designed to make audiences feel like observers dropped into a real environment rather than spectators watching a carefully staged performance. The camera participated in the chaos rather than recording it from a comfortable distance. The film never pretended to care much about geographic accuracy either. The story takes place in Korea during the early 1950s, but the production never left California, and the American landscape barely attempted to disguise itself. Hills, vegetation, and terrain looked distinctly like what they were, and no serious effort was made to recreate authentic Korean geography. Altman was not interested in that kind of literal truthfulness because he understood that the setting functioned symbolically rather than documentarily. The camp needed to feel isolated, pressure-filled, and suffocating, and achieving that emotional atmosphere mattered far more than any obligation to visual precision. Resources stayed focused on performance and tone rather than expensive location work that would have added authenticity audiences weren't actually looking for. Viewers absorbed in the characters and the chaos were not studying backgrounds for geographic accuracy, and the inconsistencies passed largely unnoticed because the film's energy carried everyone forward without pause. Emotional truth operated independently of visual precision, and Altman chose the former without hesitation every time they came into conflict. The operating room sequences pushed further against studio comfort than almost anything else in production. Surgery in films of this era was typically sanitized for mainstream audiences. Blood kept minimal. Procedures kept vague. Cameras maintaining respectful distances from anything too graphic or clinical. MASH went in exactly the opposite direction. The surgical scenes were detailed, visceral, and unapologetically realistic in ways that made executives deeply uncomfortable during screenings. Real medical terminology filled the dialogue. Pacing mimicked actual procedures rather than dramatic shortcuts, and medical professionals have been consulted to ensure the authenticity that the filmmakers were determined to preserve against industry pressure to soften it. The result was footage that felt genuinely clinical, closer to documentary than traditional Hollywood drama. This realism served a crucial dramatic purpose. By grounding the operating room in physical authenticity, the film raised emotional stakes enormously. These were not abstract casualties. They were bodies being pieced back together by exhausted doctors, and that reality anchored the entire film in human cause that the dark comedy could never fully obscure or erase. Sound throughout the film works against the audience in the same way everything else does, refusing to provide the comfortable guidance that conventional mixing offers. In most films, important dialogue sits clearly above background noise, and viewers always know where to direct their attention. MASH deliberately collapses that hierarchy. Dialogue, announcements, ambient noise, and music collide constantly, creating a sonic environment designed to disorient rather than clarify. The camp's public address system blares throughout, frequently drowning out conversations happening in the foreground. Characters speak while helicopters roar overhead and equipment clatters nearby. Altman layered these sounds intentionally, refusing to clean the mix or privilege any single element over the chaos surrounding it. Viewers experience the same sensory overload that characters endure daily, with no quiet corner available where clarity returns. The sound design creates genuine stress and exhaustion in the audience, making them feel the grinding pressure of the environment rather than simply observing it. The chaos in the audio was a carefully constructed choice that worked alongside every other element to deny comfortable spectatorship. Authority figures throughout the film receive treatment that is quietly more devastating than any direct mockery could achieve. Military commanders in most war films carry weight, whether heroic or villainous. They command dramatic presence and narrative significance. Here they appear hollow, emotionally disconnected, going through institutional motions without purpose or meaning. Officers deliver orders that feel pointless, enforce rules serving no logical function, and occupy positions of power without demonstrating competence or conviction of any kind. Altman directed these performances to emphasize detachment over menace, and the effect is more corrosive than exaggerated buffoonery ever could be. By presenting authority as vacant rather than evil, the film suggests that institutional power itself is a problem. There is no conspiracy or cruelty driving the machinery, just hollow figures filling hollow roles, because the system requires bodies in certain positions regardless of what those bodies actually contribute. Power appears not terrifying but absurd, maintained through bureaucratic habit rather than any genuine human leadership. Attentive viewers of MASH are rewarded in ways that casual viewers never access, because Altman filled every frame with background activity that contains its own narratives, jokes, and character moments entirely separate from whatever's happening in the foreground. Extras perform ongoing routines. Visual gags unfold without acknowledgement from the main characters. Secondary stories develop through gestures and glances that the camera never emphasizes. These background elements were carefully choreographed to create an environment that breathes and exists independently of the central plot. Repeat viewings reveal layers that first-time audiences inevitably miss. Throwaway moments in corners of frames becoming running jokes across multiple scenes. Relationships developing through details so subtle they barely register on initial viewing. Altman was building something closer to an immersive world than a conventional narrative, and the richness accumulates across viewings in ways that make the film feel perpetually unexhausted. The music operates with a particular kind of dishonesty that is central to how the film manipulates emotional response. Conventional film scores reinforce what is happening on screen, sad scenes receiving melancholy accompaniment, emotional moments swelling with orchestration designed to confirm how audiences should feel. MASH frequently does the opposite, placing upbeat or cheerful music against grim imagery in a deliberate mismatch that refuses to let viewers settle into expected emotional states. When light music accompanies dark moments, the dissonance forces simultaneous processing of contradictory signals, and the gap between what is seen and what is heard becomes its own source of uncomfortable meaning. The score does not comfort or guide. It comments, often sarcastically, on what is unfolding visually. Altman understood that music shapes emotional interpretation more powerfully than most viewers consciously realize, and by turning that influence against itself, He transformed the score into critique rather than support. The music exposes a machinery of cinematic emotion while still employing it. Improvisation repeatedly rescued scenes that were failing under scripted conditions. When dialogue felt stiff or staging failed to capture intended energy, Altman's response was not to call for a reshoot or reach for editing room fixes. He encourages actors to abandon the script entirely and rebuild the scene through pure improvisation in real time with cameras rolling. Performers would experiment with new readings, invent dialogue, and change blocking until something clicked into place through the creative chaos unfolding naturally in front of the lens. Some of the film's most memorable moments exist precisely because original plans collapsed completely, with failure serving as a catalyst for discovery rather than a setback requiring damage control. The production's best surprises frequently came from moments when the blueprint stopped working and collective instinct took over, and Altman's willingness to trust his cast in those moments paid off repeatedly throughout the shoot. The ending refuses to provide what cinema has trained audiences to expect and feel entitled to after 2 hours of storytelling investment. No climactic victory arrives. No clear lesson gets delivered. No indication emerges that anything fundamental has changed or been resolved. The story simply stops, leaving viewers without the closure they have been conditioned to receive. This refusal to resolve is not a storytelling failure, but the film's final and most important statement. Altman wanted the ending to mirror the endless cycles of institutional life. Wars continuing, bureaucracies persisting, individual experiences getting absorbed into systems that outlast everyone trapped inside them. A tidy conclusion will betray everything the film spent its runtime establishing about futility and repetition. Characters survive and cope and move forward, but the machinery surrounding them remains identical. The open ending forces audiences to carry the discomfort rather than leaving it in the theater. Everyone involved understood that setting this story during the Korean War provided useful historical distance, while allowing commentary on something far more immediate. By the time the film reached theaters, another war dominated American consciousness, and audiences watching surgical teams piece soldiers back together were not thinking about the 1950s. They were thinking about nightly news broadcasts showing current casualties. The historical setting allowed the movie to comment on ongoing events without directly naming them or inviting the censorship battles that explicit contemporary setting would have triggered. Because it never identified its true target explicitly, the film retained relevance that more direct satire would have lost over time. One war became every war. The specific details receded and the universal patterns remained: institutional absurdity, human cost, and the dark humor that emerges whenever people find themselves trapped inside systems larger than themselves. The film ultimately won the Palme d'Or, cinema's most prestigious international honor, which at the time struck many observers as genuinely improbable. An anarchic American war comedy seemed like an unlikely candidate for recognition from a festival associated with artistic refinement and seriousness. The jury saw something different from what studio executives had dismissed as technical flaws and commercial risks. They recognized genuine innovation, a filmmaker using disorder as sophisticated language rather than hiding incompetence behind chaos. The award legitimized experimental approaches that Hollywood had been treating as unmarketable, announcing that deliberate rule-breaking could represent advancement rather than failure. Prestige followed rebellion rather than punishing it, and the ripple spread forward through decades of filmmaking that came afterward, overlapping dialogue, documentary cinematography, ensemble storytelling, and tonal complexity, all becoming more common after this film demonstrated their viability. The lasting influence was never planned. It emerged from creative risks taken in the moment by a director solving immediate problems, and those solutions accidentally created new possibilities for everyone who came after. The disorder was always a design. It just took the rest of cinema a while to catch up.